We are in Romans, the 12th chapter. And speaking of sunshine, we looked at all the wonderful things that God has provided for us. Of course, we've noted almost every study, if not every study, that Paul's premise is that we now can be saved through faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's found in Romans 1, 16 and 17. And he spends the better part of 11 chapters talking about all the many different facets of that. And the fact that we have these wonderful blessings and different elements of those blessings. And then in chapter 12, as we started into what's commonly called the mini Bible or the small Bible, he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, or because of these wonderful things, by the mercies of God, because chapter 11 ended talking about God's default position of mercy. Because of the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God. And verse 2 then, he says that we're not to be conformed to the world. In other words, because God has done all this for you, don't be like the rest of the world. Don't be like everyone else. Be different. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove that which is the good. I've got two different translations going here. What is good and acceptable and perfect will of God, DSV says. So he says, here's what I want you to do. Don't be like the rest of the world. Be sunshine. Or as we're going to look in the Sermon on the Mount a little bit later today, be the light of the world. Reflect my light so those around you can see it. Well, that's wonderful. We all like the idea of the sunshine. But being the sun, or really more directly, more accurately reflecting God's light, is a little bit more difficult, right? And so he's talking about how it is that we as Christians can be different. Now, we have covered through verse 16, and I believe today we will cover 17 through 21. And if I noted, we're covering even less verses than is common for us because these are very broad and intense topics that he's generally covering, saying do this, but there is a lot to what he is saying. Before we read here, starting in verse 17, I see Lance hollered out this morning. Lance, we've been praying for you and Heather, and hope that she continues to do well. Would someone read 17 through 21 of Romans, the 12th chapter? Repay, no, you guys are afraid there's big names in there, huh? Everyone's scanning the check first. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In that last verse, verse 21, I know I'm starting at the end and working backwards, but it's a summary of what it means to be conformed, or not to be conformed to this world, but rather be transformed. Essentially, when we look at it, it seems so logical. It seems to make so much sense until we try to enact it. Do not be overcome with evil. What's the temptation of this world? Someone treats me poorly. I don't like that, right? That's right. Mike is absolutely right. He says that's your first reaction, and it is wrong. And when you think about the logic of that, and of course it's not logical, is it? It's emotional. Emotions can be helpful or they can be hindrances. So when we think about the logic of that, someone has wronged me, and so that makes them, right in our minds, a horrible person. Well, why would you do exactly what makes them a horrible person? Well, when you put it that way, it seems kind of silly, doesn't it? But it's what we do. The idea is we're to be different. Don't be overcome with evil. Overcome evil with good. Be different. If you didn't like the way they treated you, don't treat them the same way. It's way easier said than done, isn't it? Way easier said than done. All right, let's look at some of the details here. Verse 17 is illustrative of that, that concept. Repay no one evil for evil. It's the first clause. No, repay no one evil for evil. That's getting right at what Mike's saying, right? Jesus deals with this, and we'll look at it today in the latter part of Matthew, the 5th chapter, that someone strikes you in the cheek. What are you supposed to do? Turn the other cheek. At least duck, right? Don't swing back, though, is Jesus' point. And Paul brought up to me, he was here one time, and Carl said that Jesus doesn't say anything to do after that, after you turn the second cheek. And that's because it's time to give it back. But we understand where, right, what Carl was saying. We understand where he's come from, but that's not the concept, is it? The idea is that we don't retaliate. We don't repay evil for evil. I dealt with this a few months ago in our lesson, and the idea is forgiveness. Escalation is the natural order of things, right? Think about how fights start. They normally start with an insult, go to a shove, and then punches are thrown. Grandpa always taught us skip the shoving part, right? Jump over step 2 and go straight to step 3. And what? Things escalate, isn't it? Until oftentimes weapons are drawn. That's no different from our personal lives to our lives in our community, in the church, and nationally. How often do you see it happen nationally? Escalation, right? Someone in our community or someone in our church has upset me, so, boy, the next chance I get, I'll show them. Then the other side says, boy, next chance I get, I'll show them. Just escalates. Isn't it interesting that forgiveness and mercy are the only ways to de-escalate? It's anything that brings an end to it. And so it's advice given by Paul here to the Romans. Before we go on to the next clause, questions or comments? Verse 17, the second clause, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all men, or strive to do what is right in the sight of all men. Doesn't matter what anyone else does. We have a standard of conduct that we're striving for. Questions, comments? Does it make Christianity seem impossible?
Discipline. And it's trying to strive to be what a Christian should be, Christ-like. It's not an easy road.
Now, Stephanie and then Dave.
I was just going to say that maybe it's just a constant battle of spiritual focus over physical, like the human side over the Christian side. Like, we don't want to be lukewarm, but we're always trying to be pleasing to God. But there is a human standpoint that's a struggle for us physically to overcome those mental battles when we're trying to do what Jesus wants us to do, as opposed to sometimes those feelings that you mentioned that come up.
Absolutely. And Stephanie mentions, among other great points, that spiritual versus physical. Paul talks a lot in all of his letters, but especially the Corinth letter, about spirit versus the flesh, right? That's an inward struggle we face. Dave?
I think it's easier the more you do it. It's like bad medicine. Once you swallow it a few times, it's easier to take.
Yeah. Yeah, we form habits, don't we? So, but doing it universally is all but impossible, isn't it? One of the things that I perceived Christianity to be growing up in the New Testament was the law was different, right? We're on Sermon on the Mount on Sunday mornings. But here's one of the shortcomings to that view, and I'm saying that was a view I had, but it's, I believe, erroneous. The New Testament's not easier to keep than the Old Testament, isn't it? Is it? That's kind of how I understood things growing up, is, we don't have to do all those animal sacrifice, but here's the law you keep to be righteous. The problem with that is Jesus in Matthew 5, that we're going to look at today, says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes, you'll in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. You don't think that's severe enough or difficult enough? By the end of chapter 5, because I know where a lot of us are thinking, well, they polluted the law. They weren't really keeping the law. Well, that's part of the point. But the end of the chapter, he says, you be holy like your Father is holy. Now, there you go. It's now out of grasp, isn't it? It's now out of our reach. I think there's two concepts. I'm planting some seeds for the lesson today, and I hope it complements what we're looking at. Two concepts that we're looking at. It is impossible. That's what Paul is dealing with, that we have salvation through faith, right? That through obedience, not perfect obedience, by faith, by acting, by following God's will, changing our heart, we have access to Christ's righteousness, right? So he serves not only as an example, which he is a powerful example, as we're reading these passages here. He did this perfectly. But he has the righteousness for us to wear and to receive, as Paul dealt with in chapters earlier. Secondly, what Jesus is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount is it's not about trying to do something. It's about being something. And I think, David, maybe you were on the very brink of something here. Verse 17 is very, very, very difficult to do. Impossible to do unless we change our view of people. And when we change our view of people, the actions get a lot easier. For instance, you've heard the mom of the guy on death row, right? Mike, that guy doesn't deserve to die, according to mom. He's just misunderstood. Right? She has a different view of him. When we look at people, and Paul's already dealt with this in the prior verses, is lowering ourselves below people we have an easier time treating them in this way. When our child throws the rock through the window, it was just an accident. When Ella does it, she's a rotten child, right? She meant to do that. See the difference? How we view one another, it's a matter of the heart, which gets to the idea of the spirit versus flesh. Questions, comments? I think verse 18 is a bit of a caveat. I don't know about you, but numerous times in my life, particularly in my business life, I hear this statement, and you call yourself a Christian. Now, there have been times where I have violated Christian principles, and that's being said. Right? But don't worry about that. I can rationalize that away. But a lot of times, what that means is you're not doing what I want you to do. And you call yourself a Christian? A lot of times that is the case. I once asked a lady who was screaming that at me, essentially, what's your definition of a Christian? It kind of calmed her down. She, well, what would a Christian do in this case? I asked her that. That de-escalated things. Right? In other words, what am I doing wrong? Now, verse 17 says, provide what is honorable in the sight of all. Verse 17, I think, is really getting at this point that there's only so much that depends upon me. In other words, as a Christian, your happiness is not dependent upon me. We can only keep peace between us if we both decide to do that. I can encourage it. I can do everything that depends upon me, but there's limits to where I can go to accomplish that peace. It's interesting, or that's important, because there is a set of people, a large number of people, who will use your goodness as leverage against you, right? And that's okay. As a Christian, we're admonished to allow that to happen to an extent. But we understand there's only so much I can do. If you're mad at me, it may not be entirely my fault. Questions, comments? I shared some of the advice of my grandfather that does not go well with Romans 12 earlier, but a piece that he other times would share that I think maybe one of the best pieces of advice that I can recall is, if there's going to be wrong done, let it be done to you, not by you. Right? Takes away the whole idea of preemptive strikes, doesn't it? Let it be done to you, not by you. Verse 19, never avenge yourselves. Oh, now I undermined the idea of preemptive strikes. Now we're getting at retaliatory strikes. Pretty much we're just eliminating all strikes here, aren't we? Never avenge yourselves. Leave it to God. In the Beatitudes last week, we looked at the idea of hunger and thirsting for righteousness. And one of the definitions of righteousness is right relationships. For me, that really helps me comprehend what relationships or what righteousness is. Right? It's about having right relationships. So if there's righteousness between Mike and I, we're have the kind of relationship that's appropriate, that is good, that we should have. If there's righteousness between God and I, it makes the kind of relationship with God I should have. Which, by the way, is a big part of the meaning of obtaining the righteousness of Christ, right? Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, he broke down that wall of enmity between peoples and between people and God. So that is where we, what the idea of righteousness is. Now, before I conclude that thought, Fred shares with us, sometimes emotions get the best of us, and he's absolutely right. We are people, right? And our emotions and our own feelings, our own needs cause us to react in litany of ways. Sometimes they're not always appropriate. And other times are. So what do we do with this idea? I think Paul is saying, don't stand up for yourself. Don't retaliate. But that brings up a problem, doesn't it? There's not righteousness there. In other words, one of my favorite sayings growing up, I never liked Dad's answer, is, that's not fair, right? And sometimes we never get rid of that habit as we get adults. We're still adults screaming, that's not fair. What I'm saying, what a child is saying at a very early age, is there's not righteousness here. You're not treating me, I'm not getting what I deserve. You're not treating me the way I should be treated. And as adults, Fred mentions our emotions. This is one of the triggers for many of our emotions. That we realize, wait, I don't deserve this. Pam, do you ever say that in your relationship? I don't deserve this? With Ernie. No. Pam's not answering. Well, I will say I've heard that. That's why I suspected that Pam, no, I didn't hear Pam say that. Let me reclassify. But when we're wronged, that presents a problem. There's no righteousness here. One of the promises of God is He will make things right. These Christians are being persecuted. They're being killed. They're watching their families die. And you want me to do nothing about it? I'll take care of this. That's what God says. I'll take care of this. I remember as a child, that was a reassuring statement. Now, the question becomes, do we have faith to believe that God will deal with it righteously? And that is what we are encouraged, we are admonished to do. By the way, it's important for us to have this mindset ahead of time. Because we are 3 to 7 seconds into an emotional change before we're capable of even realizing it. You ever have someone say to you, I don't mean to get you upset. And the first thing you say is, I remember this thing. I am upset. We see emotional changes before we realize we're in them. Normally 3 to 7 seconds before you're even capable of realizing you had a change. The reason I say that and share that with you is it's important to have a mindset ahead of time. I've been told at times, boy, you're good at keeping your cool. I've been told at times, wow, you lose your temper really fast. I've went into situations where I've said, I'm not going to lose my temper. And I can do that. Then I've been caught by surprise, and that's when the other side of the statement is used. Our mindset and preparation going into situations is important.
If you don't have time to think about it, that's when stuff hits the fan.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, you have to have, it takes a lot to get me mad. And then when I do get mad, I really lose my temper. And I don't like to do that.
Yep.
And then you're all upset. And you try to, different situations I know I've been in, I've calmed some things down pretty good, you know. But you have to be real careful
Yes,
because they'll throw it in your face.
absolutely. And Bob, I think you did a better job of drawing out what I was trying to get at. The mindset that God will make things right, it's not my responsibility. To stand up for myself will help. Stephanie.
I think sometimes even when you have maybe an emotional reaction or something verbally you want to say in regards to your emotions, sometimes it's better to sit on those thoughts and think through it so you can have a better spiritual response versus the physical retaliation. And basically, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Try to use the ears more than the mouth for you. That's helped me in some situations.
Absolutely. Great point. So to the contrary, if your enemy hunger, feed him. I remember a situation years and years ago. Amanda was in a heightened emotional state at the time. She'd just the weekend before had her door kicked in her apartment at Penn State. And 2 guys that were meaning to rob the drug dealers who were living next door. However, they either didn't know their right from their left or got confused, kicked in the wrong door, and it was a traumatic situation, as you might imagine. And you can imagine how people react when they want money and drugs, and you're telling them there is no money or drugs in your apartment. And Amanda came home the following weekend, was working for Dad, and she took gentleman out on a ride, and he didn't like one of the policies that really his insurance enacts, and he's blowing up on Amanda. And they got back to the trail ride, and we're gathering in, and he's yelling and screaming. And this is a local individual who was from our community here. Amanda is trying to apologize to him and say, I'm sorry, I'm just following the rules. And he says, I can't wait to see you wrecked alongside the road so I can stand by and watch you bleed to death. Right? Now, if this individual was sober and rational, that would, we all understand. In fact, when I say that, and it's the response it's meant to have, you're shocked, right? That's where nature takes us, though. Bob talked about losing your temper. We all do things we wouldn't do otherwise. Here's our default position. We all recognize that's wrong. Christianity says go to the other extreme. Here's the water for your drive home. You know, here's food when you hunger. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and Adam Clarke in his commentary had a great poem. I actually printed it off, and wait, yeah, I did leave it at home. And so I'll read it again to myself just to appreciate it later, but you won't get to hear it. This idea of heaping coals on someone's head is talking about the purification of one's conscience, right? It's not about making that person suffer. It's about hopefully purifying them as you would purify iron with fire. And that's the process that is being referenced. And by the way, this is a quote from Proverbs 25, verses 21 and 22, if you don't have that written in your Bibles. So the idea is that we would win someone over to Christ, not that we would make them suffer. And hence this last statement, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. My last example on that is, I think Martin Luther King is probably the greatest example of this in modern history. He accomplished more than any other civil rights activist, and his policy was, don't you ever take a swing. Because the moment you do, right or wrong, you justify everything they already believed about you. And we would all do well to remember that. The moment we take a swing, we justify in someone else's mind every negative concept they have about us and about Christianity. Questions, comments? I am thankful that it does not depend on perfect adherence to these principles to make it into heaven, right? They are goals. They are standards. They are aims for us to shoot for. Questions or comments? We've ended 4 minutes early, but we're going to let that stand rather than get into submitting to the government. But basically, as we look ahead, he's going to say, take these same individual principles and how we react to one another and apply them to your government. God made your fellow mankind. God put your government in place of power for a reason. So we'll pick up there next week. Thank you.